welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Suzanne Rumsey. She's a professor at the Purdue University at Fort Wayne, and she teaches English and technical writing. She has a Ph.D. in critical studies in literacy from Michigan State University, and in 2021, she wrote a book called Blessed Are the Peacemakers, Small Histories During World War II, Letter Writing and Family History Methodology. So you got started on this project by going through some things that you found in a basement. Can you tell us about that?
Well, my paternal grandmother passed away in 2013, and for whatever reason, I was handed this lumpy cardboard box, and I looked inside and I thought, oh look, there's some letters, and I put it away so that I didn't have to think about it because, you know, it's the academic year. About a year later, I opened it up, and I kept unfolding more and more letters, and there ended up being more than 400 love letters between my grandmother and grandfather during World War II.
So you read this first one and were intrigued and read the next one and
kind
kept
of.
going, yeah.
Some of them were in sort of packets, so they were in order, but they were all kind of tossed together, and once I got intrigued by it, there was a fairly lengthy process of simply just putting them in chronological order, figuring out what he's saying from one end and she's saying from the other.
So it was both.
It was
letters.
Both sides.
Oh, that's unusual to find both, isn't it?
That's exactly it, yes.
Yeah.
You don't often find that the letters are saved from both parties. And through it, I explored sort of the small histories, or what I call them, of World War II. So histories of individual people. Through it, I was able to examine letter writing as a genre. And through those letters, I was also able to explore the concept of family history writing, or expanding on what we know of genealogy.
So let's talk about letter writing as a genre. Do people study this?
Not really.
No.
It is a lesser studied genre. I found that there was one really good book written in around 2000 or so. Prior to that, there's not a lot. If we look at sort of rhetorical study theory and history, we can find that there's Ars Dictaminis, which was in the Middle Ages, and prior to that, it goes back to sort of the foundations of literacy with cuneiform and sending things across the miles, usually financial information.
That's interesting. I would have, with all of the collections of letters that have been published over the years, I would think there would have been more interest in that.
Well, I think studying it, it was relegated to the school system rather than to higher academics around the turn of the century. And so you'll find that letter writing is a topic that shows up in school books. But once it reaches sort of the research level, it just dies down because everyone knows what a letter looks like. Everyone knows what it should be like. Yeah,
a lot of us, I think, have books of collections of letters from famous people, and I know my experience reading them is that it seems like I might be reading letters from a novelist, maybe, right? That they spend as much thought writing those letters as they did writing their literary works.
Right, and I think that's one of the really odd things about it. Certainly there's different kinds of studies, mostly literary, of such things, but in terms of my field of composition and rhetoric, there's just been no attention given to it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because you might argue that we're kind of at our best when we're writing letters because it's one-on-one, and we know that every word is going to be carefully read and weighed, and it's not always the case if you're writing a 600-page novel or something.
Very good point. So,
and this was a husband and wife who were separated because of World War II.
Correct.
Maybe we could go into some detail on that. They were both members of the same church.
They were part of what's called the Dunkard Brethren Church. My great-grandfather, Benjamin Elias Kessler Sr., broke away from the larger Brethren in Christ Church and created the Dunkard Brethren. They were a denomination that was plain Anabaptist is the phrase that would get used, which just means they believed in adult baptism. They were incredibly conservative, and they were one of the historic peace churches, which means that they were pacifists.
So your grandfather then was a conscientious objector.
He was. So when he was drafted into the military, he was able to file on his draft card that he was, instead of 1A, which would have sent him into the Army, he was registered as 4E, which said that he was a conscientious objector with religious reasons, and that's what put him, instead of into the war itself, into something called civilian public service.
And so that separated them, and that's what gets us started.
Yes.
I understand there's a period of 2 years here where there was a lot of intense letter writing going on.
There was a lot of intense letter writing, yes. He traveled to his first CPS camp in Pennsylvania. The turnpike there had just opened, and he was planting rose bushes and bittersweet to prevent erosion. And she was still back home in Goshen, Indiana, where I'm from, just carrying on without him and earning enough money to support them both.
So if somebody's studying World War II, this gives us a different perspective of the war, doesn't it?
Very much, in a couple of critical ways. One, CPS itself only had about 12,000 men, drafted men who ended up in the program. There's a significantly larger number that either were jailed or fled, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So these are men that were patriots but not willing to harm another person, and so the government found a way for them to still serve, but not in the actual war.
Yeah. So this husband and wife went off together initially, right?
No, originally he went off by himself and she was at home.
Oh, and then she joined him later.
And then she joined him later.
Okay.
They were apart for about a year, and that's the bulk of the letters that I have.
Okay.
And then they were pretty desperate to be together, so he took a transfer to a mental hospital in Rhode Island, and she joined him there, and they both worked as mental health assistants or techs.
And so if somebody reads this book, they're getting insights about both of these environments then, aren't they, right?
Correct.
One of them being what was going on at mental hospitals during the war, because they didn't have the facilities that they needed.
They didn't have the
always,
facilities,
right?
but I think at the time there were some pretty archaic methods for sort of controlling people with mental illness, but also they were severely understaffed because of the war. So even places like the one they served at in Rhode Island, which was comparatively better than other hospitals, they were severely understaffed, so more archaic techniques were used. And then my grandfather and other conscientious objectors came in and sort of refused to use force, refused to restrain or harm any of the patients. And that made them markedly different, and also the brunt of a lot of sort of abuse from the other attendants.
So this is some real personal insights into what was going on at that point.
Yeah.
What about this work project, this CPS project? What did you learn about that we might not have known otherwise?
So CPS, like I said, it's about 12,000 men, and there were CPS camps all across the United States. My grandfather was part of one that was run by the Mennonite Church, in part because we were from Goshen, Indiana, which is where, say, like Goshen College is, and there's a lot of Mennonites. There were camps, like I said, across the United States. They served in a variety of ways. I would say the majority of them were agricultural in some nature. The second most would have been hospital work of some kind. And then the third most would have been sort of more extreme ones. There were ones that served as like forest fire people out in the West.
So you've researched these camps in addition to just
talking about
the nature of the letters. You also have some insights about Miriam's struggle to support herself, right? Because they weren't paying her husband when they took him away, right?
One of the things that was really difficult about being a conscientious objector, in CPS is that the government did not pay them. And so when even German POWs were paid per day, men who were being faithful to their country were not, simply because they refused to fight. And so that was one egregious issue, but the secondary issue, which is probably more egregious, is that their spouses or their dependents received no compensation from the government to support them.
Yeah.
So Miriam was on her own. She was 17, and certainly she had family to stay with, but she had to earn enough money.
So if I can interrupt for a second, it's interesting, as you set this up, you're giving us the statistical side of it, right?
Sure.
Which is what we all know, right? But what you're about to say now is what nobody's going to know, because
nobody's going to know.
We don't have these stacks of letters to read, right? So give us the personal side of this now.
Well, Miriam ended up, because she had to earn enough money to support herself and to send money to Ben, she ended up being a live-in maid, and she sold their house. And again, she was 17 years old, and there was a lot in the letters about how difficult it was when she didn't have a clue what she was doing.
Yeah.
And I think too that it puts in perspective what women at home were experiencing, but women who were very different than the women we think of for World War II. Yeah. We think of Rosie the Riveter.
Yeah, she wasn't Rosie the Riveter.
No, she was quiet and humble and low and hidden, essentially. Nothing is known about them. So even the history books about CPS have very, very little about women.
So let's go back to the things you learned about what they were doing, right? You researched these projects that the civilian public service groups were doing. Some of them were forestry projects, some were labor and soil conservation. Can we explore that a little bit?
The soil conservation, that's where Ben would have been during his first year. So I have his example mostly to build upon. And so the Turnpike had just opened in Pennsylvania. And if you've been to the Turnpike, there's very steep hills there. And so they were planting rose bushes, bittersweet, I forget what all else, but in order to plant them on these very steep hills, they had what were called harnesses. And so one man would literally put himself in a harness and go down using a rope, and the rope was tied to another man at the top. And the top man would be holding the rope.
I don't think OSHA would approve of this today.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And my grandfather, and they'd hold the rope while the other person swung around and planted things. And I remember Ben saying something to the effect of, "I'm heavy enough that I don't think I'll have to be in the harness." And then sure enough, 2 days later, he said, "Well, I was wrong."
I was in the harness.
And he commented on how strange it was to hold a man's life in his hands. So I had found a picture of it in some archive, and then it didn't make it in the book. It really, really showed how dramatic that the steep hills were, and then I never found it again, so I couldn't find it to include.
And these people weren't paid?
None. They had no health insurance either.
And women during this time didn't have to worry about being drafted, but many of them volunteered for this service as well, right?
There was a fairly sizable, when I say sizable, there were about 2,000 women who joined civilian public service as volunteers. And so Miriam fits into that group in the latter part of their time, where she was considered a CPS wife, if you will. And she then was also an attendant. And honestly, in the mental hospitals, women helpers were more desperately needed than men.
Yeah, I'm sure. So what kinds of things did the women do? Not just Miriam, but other people that you learned about?
My understanding is that most of them were near their husbands that were involved. And so in hospital settings, they did the same thing as other attendants. So they worked with women mental health patients. They were in the kitchens cooking, they cleaned. If they were in situations where it was more of the forestry or agriculture, they did what a lot of the same things the men did. I mean, they wouldn't have been planting things, but they would have been back at camp, preparing meals and cleaning for the men to come back from their work day.
Well, it's interesting to talk about this as something that happened in history, right? But it's really kind of a profound change from what we experience today. I mean, try to imagine somebody being put in this position today, husband and wife sent off somewhere and working and not being paid. And did they room together? I assume they gave them quarters, right?
It was an awkward time because and all of this had to take place over letters. So where you or I would I would use the phone, right?
Yeah.
I know people younger than us might text as their first response, but they had to figure out all the details of her moving just over letters. And so by the time she joined him, they did have sort of a house that had individual rooms that married couples would stay in.
That's very interesting. So let's go to the academic side of the equation here for a minute here. What does this tell us about letter writing? What have you learned about letter writing from reading these letters?
So I theorized, as I said earlier, letter writing is not studied a lot, at least in composition and rhetoric. And so the two theories that I came out with were that in this instance, letters served as what I call a conduit and a platform. The conduit was sort of the flow between the two people. So they were in love, they were trying very hard to establish a connection over the miles through these pieces of paper.
So they were a medium, we might say,
They were
right?
medium. Yeah. There would be small little kisses that said, "Here's my kiss," in the bottom corner, and it was sort of a tangible, way of connecting. And platform was that tangible way. So the conduit was sort of the through, and the platform is they had to find something stable to maintain their relationship, sort of theoretically like build upon. And so sort of the material of the letter itself is something like that their spouse held and wrote on just days before, and that kept a connection there as well. So beyond ars dictaminis, which was just a formal study of things, this gives us new insight into how letters function rhetorically between two people, or could function.
So if I understand what you're saying, the subject of the letter writing was often things that had been mentioned in the letters, and not just, they weren't picking up old conversations necessarily, or things like that.
They were. It wasn't necessarily about it being a conduit. It's my theory imposed upon what they were writing. So they'd start their letters with things like, come and sit on the Davenport with me, or knock, knock, may I come in? And it just felt like they were coming home from a day at work. And then they'd start up with, what had happened during the day to both of them. And because I had such a large body of letters, I was able to trace the back and forth over months, and see how they built their relationship, maintained their relationship, and the letters served as that medium, as you said it.
And there's another tradition that you're tapping into here, and that's the writing of family histories, right?
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about the study of family history writing and how this plays into that.
Well, a lot of people have been and are really interested in genealogy, and there's a lot of public discourse around genealogy, around things like Ancestry.com. A lot of people are getting the genetic testing from something like 23andMe.
Yeah.
And by and large, I feel like the academic community has not responded to this public discourse, and to this. They think of it as sort of trendy, if you will.
Yeah.
And genealogy tends to be viewed as sort of the retired, bespectacled, retired, old person that's sort of hunkered down and sending emails that no one wants to read. And instead, I try and take what I call family history writing and move outside of that stereotype. And I'm looking at it as a way of weaving personal stories with historical accounts, with archival information, with actually visiting sites, interviewing people, and all of those things together create a much more in-depth and vibrant history of individuals than a simple genealogy would do.
Yeah, I would love to be able to put my family history together on all those points. So you're talking about connecting the dots here that people usually don't connect, right?
Correct, and digging a lot deeper than a lot of folks are able to connect. I was truly blessed to find this giant box, and not everyone has that. So I'm teaching a grad seminar right now, and it's walking students through the process of thinking outside the box. They might research their family as far as they can go, and then what do they do? Well, okay, research the area, research the business or the workplace, research. Maybe there's this tangent, there's a newspaper story, and all of a sudden they start digging a little deeper at things that might seem off topic, and they find yet more.
That's very interesting. Did you think that some of these programs like 23andMe could be modified to let people upload letters and pictures and things? Wouldn't that be interesting if we could do that?
I think so. I think Ancestry.com, I haven't been on in a while. I think it does have the capacity to have pictures in particular. I don't know about if it's not considered valuable to the archives, and archives are, what's considered valuable tends to be popular discourse and not the quiet and not the mundane writing as much. Also, the amount of letters I had, I calculated the word count and how long the book would be. An average book, it would have been about 850 pages. So it wouldn't really be feasible to put all that online.
Yeah, I suppose, but there's a lot of things that we could be sharing that I think we might benefit from having the capacity to do that. So now another category here that you touch on is this concept of historical scholarship, right? And as I was alluding to this earlier, we know the statistics about the war, and we know the big stories, right? We all know a lot about Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, but this is adding another layer to our understanding of history, isn't it? Can we talk about that a little bit?
It is. It sort of is outside of what I would call academic history. Not because I don't use some of the same methodology to find material. But because I value story and I see story and narrative differently, I'm not looking necessarily for fact. I'm valuing sort of the folklore as much, or the insider information. I think everybody, once you start talking about, I had this uncle who served in the war, they speak up right away and say, oh, you know, I have an uncle, or I have a sibling, or my neighbor had all of these things that were kept in some attic somewhere, some basement, that nobody knows about because they don't follow the master narrative that we have about the war.
Yeah, well, and which also, you know, makes me think about all the oral histories that we have that disappear, right?
Exactly.
I know I had an uncle that fought in the war, and he had a very unusual story, and I remember that story very well. I don't think anybody else in my family knows that. My children don't know who he was, so there's no point in my telling them, and it just gets lost, right?
Right.
Do you think that the personal narratives are more likely to get lost than obviously than the big narratives? And
I think so. A lot of people, when they would find sort of these box of trinkets, they don't necessarily see them as valuable, because they save mundane items that are ephemeral, if you will. They're meant to be thrown away.
Yeah.
Instead, I opened a box and I found, you know, the books of stamps for rationing, that some of them were torn out.
Yeah.
And that should have been thrown away, you know, by the time they were done with the war. But she kept them for whatever reason.
what about Miriam? Do you have any sense? Did she keep rereading these letters? How old was she when she passed away?
When she passed away, I believe she was around 85 or so.
Okay.
She tended toward the Depression era of keeping everything.
Yeah.
And so the family going through her things, I'm sort of baffled that this box managed to be saved. And the letters seemed like they had been handled many times over.
Really?
They were
Yeah.
not pristine. I mean, they'd been through the mail.
Yeah.
But then you'd see that they had smudges on them, or they had, that she'd cried over one of them. There'd be tear splashes, that sort of thing.
Well, so what's your advice? Should we save our letters?
I think so. I think that if this is something that interests you, save them. If not, find someone in your family that might find them interesting. One of the things that might be important is to maybe organize them a little bit, so that if you do pass them on, it's not just sort of this collection of stuff.
Is there a privacy issue here, though? I mean, if somebody sent me a letter and they were just sending this to me, do I really have a right to save that and pass that along to some third party who won't understand the context?
That's one of the methodological challenges of this particular kind of writing, and that is sort of weighing and measuring what do you include, and more importantly, what do you leave out.
Yeah.
And for me and my grandparents, I know that they've passed on, so I know that they would be okay with, you know, what I did. I also talked with a lot of family members to make sure that they were okay. So my father and my aunts and uncles, to make sure that they were okay with what I included. And then there's just sort of a respect, and then it's making plain in your text that you, the researcher, are challenged by this, that you're trying very hard to be authentic and accurate, but authentic is...
To assuage your guilt, essentially.
Well, in some ways, but also just to offer up the methodological triangulation and verification as much as possible.
So, you know, are you concerned about what's going to happen in the future? Because most of our correspondence is on email, and I can't read my emails from 15 years ago because the software won't.
Exactly. I don't know
download them.
that concern is the right word. I think I'm more curious to find out what will be saved and what won't be saved for future generations.
But the question is, how will it be saved, right?
And I'd have no idea. I know that my mom saved some emails for me when it was in the late 90s, and she saved them and printed them for some reason, and so she has them. So I think that things might be saved. We'll see what technology does.
I'm a photographer, and if I print a photograph, I can print it with archival inks on archival paper. Do you think we need an archival format for saving documents in that we know will be maintained historically?
I think so. What's difficult about archives is that there's someone who decides what's valuable and what isn't valuable. And oftentimes things like family history writing aren't considered valuable because they're about individuals and not about larger historical things. And so I would say that some of this comes down to the researcher and their choices for how to maintain their own personal archives, or, you know, make them accessible to the next group of people that would be interested.
Yeah, and so you talk about an aging and literacy development. How does that fit with this here?
Well, part of my research is, aside from the book, is just aging and literacy practices. So I look at how older adults either maintain literacy through a variety of different methods, or they hold on, is the phrase I would use. Sometimes they let things go if they're no longer in the workforce. And so one thing that I think was really valuable about the text is that aging and life story writing kind of go hand in hand. When someone has mental space to start thinking about their life, they're prone to wanting to write their life story. And so then I found that I've worked with a couple different nonprofits helping older adults put words to it to share what they have to younger generations.
Okay, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Suzanne Rumsey for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.